So welcome everyone. This, as Rob mentioned, this is the Aquatic Health and Safety Awareness Campaign. This is webinar number 1 of 3. This webinar is titled Identifying Slip, Trip, and Fall Hazards. And then, as I mentioned, there's 2 other webinars. So the next webinar will be on the different types of fall protection. And then the third webinar will be fall protection plans and system implementation. As Rob mentioned, my name is Brendan Kerber. I'm a senior engineer with High Engineering, and I specialize in fall protection and fall prevention. So I'll be discussing how to identify slips, trips, and fall hazards. Our agenda for today, we're going to talk about hazard identification. Then we'll talk about recognizing fall hazards. And then finally, we'll talk about some common hazards at aquatic centers as they apply directly to you at your different centers. We'll start off with a disclaimer. This webinar is for information only. It's meant to be to raise awareness, help you to learn what questions to ask, what are good questions. And like I said, it's mainly for awareness. It's not a full training course. Hazard assessments and using fall protection do require in-depth training. So if that's something you're looking at, you need to do some more detailed training. And for that, you need to consult an authorized training provider to receive that detailed training. To start with, we'll look at some definitions. The first definition we want to look at is a slip. So what is a slip? It is, according to Merriam-Webster's online dictionary, to slide out of place or away from a support, or also to slide on or down a slippery surface. Fairly simple, but we just want to make sure we're talking about the same things. Everyone has a common understanding of these terms before we even look at identifying the hazards associated. Next, a trip. A trip is to catch your foot against something so as to stumble. And then a fall. This is to descend freely by the force of gravity. And both slips and trips can cause falls, but they may not necessarily, but often they will. And then our last definition is a hazard, which is a source of danger. And slips, trips, and falls are all different types of hazards. As a result, they pose different types of danger to us as humans. Before we select any kind or any means of protection, the hazards must be identified and evaluated. And that's what we are going to look at in this webinar, is how do we identify these different hazards, slip hazards, trip hazards, and fall hazards, primarily fall hazards, but we'll talk about the first 2 as well. And then once we've identified them, then we can look at how do we protect against them. And that's going to be covered mainly in the following 2 webinars. This one's focused only on the identification assessment of these hazards. So looking at identifying the hazards or hazard identification, first thing, we need to do some kind of hazard assessment. This is actually required in the Alberta Occupational Health and Safety Regulations. So this is covered in Part 2. And it requires that an employer must assess and identify existing and potential hazards before the work begins. So this requires looking over the work site or the work area, and then assessing every potential hazard that could influence the workers in that work site. And then once they've done that assessment, they need to prepare a report with the results of that assessment. So the results need to include what the hazards are, and then also what the methods are to control or eliminate those. As I mentioned already, we're only going to talk about the first part, assessing the hazards, and then we'll talk about methods of control and elimination in later webinars. Another thing that's important to note in the regulations is that the employer must repeat this assessment at reasonable intervals. So this could be, on a yearly basis or some kind of term that's determined as appropriate by the employer and industry standard. Also, if anything changes. So if there's a start of a new work practice, if the kind of work you're doing is changing, if there's new construction, any kind of changes, you need to redo your hazard assessment to make sure you identify and then protect any of those new hazards. And then finally, The employer must be sure to involve any affected workers in the assessment and control of that hazard. So maybe you're not an employer, you still have a role to play in this hazard assessment, in that if you are the one who's going to be doing the work, the employer has a responsibility to involve you to make sure you have a say. You notice something that's dangerous, you have that right and that responsibility to participate and help identify the hazards, and then have a say in how you can control them. And this is important because it helps make sure you are protecting yourself as well. And there's a couple different ways, there's multiple different ways to do hazard assessments and to identify the different hazards. One way, which if you've taken any other AMHSA webinars, you probably have seen this, or you will see this, is the energy wheel. So there's an icon of it here. And what this does is it provides 10 different categories to categorize the different forms of energy and how these could potentially be a hazard to you and cause injury or damage. So for this webinar, where we're talking about slips, trips, and falls, that's all due to gravity. So that's the top one, the 12 o'clock position. We've got gravity. It's all due to gravity pulling us closer to the ground. So as I mentioned, it classifies it in 10 broad different categories, and you can use this kind of to compare. Is it gravity? Is it temperature? Is it mechanical? What are the different categories? It just helps you start thinking about the different forms of energy that might hurt you. Associated with the energy wheel, there's also an energy calculator. So the one shown on the screen here is from a safety function. And what it does is it actually calculates the amount of energy you will receive based on the height you fall. So in this calculator, you can enter your mass or your weight and the height. And this enables you to get an actual numerical value for the amount of energy associated with that fall. And then it's very easy to compare the energy numbers from one fall to another. In this case, they also have energy calculations for the other hazards. So you can compare one hazard to another based on a number, and that's very easy to compare. So on the screen here, in the example, we have a 150-pound mass, or 150-pound person, falling a height of 10 feet. And that will generate just over 2,000 joules, or just under 1,500 foot-pounds of energy. And then it has a nice graph where it plots a little cross there is this energy, and we can see it's above that high energy line. So something we probably want to be protecting because it's high energy. So this calculation of fall energy, it's very useful, as I said, for comparing a numerical value. It's very easy to compare if one number is higher than another. And the only thing is, with slips, trips, and falls, there's a number of factors that go into that. Just having a single energy number might not be the most beneficial, especially if we're looking at the same worker. If I'm doing this assessment, my weight is always going to be the same. It's not going to change. So the only thing in this calculator that's going to change is the height. And there's a lot more that goes into a slip hazard or a fall hazard than just the height of the fall, which is what we're going to talk about in this webinar. So this is a good starting point. It gives you a nice numerical value to compare, but there's a lot of other things we need to think about as well. Another method of identifying hazards and assessing hazards is to look at the risks. So a standard formula for determining what risk is to take the probability of that event occurring and multiply it by the severity of that event occurring. So we could say, maybe there's a 10% chance of falling, on the severity. Severity can be difficult to determine, but the most common in insurance and risk management is to assign a dollar value. So if we say there's a 10% chance of falling, and the fall results in an injury that costs maybe $100,000, that will give us a risk number when we multiply those two together. So to do this in depth requires a lot of detail. You need to hire insurance people, statisticians, actuarialists. A lot of people need to be involved to try and find out what the actual probability is, and then what the cost is associated with that, or the severity is with that. Very time consuming, it's very expensive just to do. And in the end, it's difficult to determine actual accurate numbers. What's to say a fall is actually 10%? probable, or 15%, or 5%. It's very difficult to determine an accurate number for that. But that doesn't mean this is completely useless either. It can be done on a more relative scale. We can just rank things from most probable to least probable, and most severe to least severe. And that gives us kind of a relative ranking of risk. One thing is more risky than the other, so we should protect the more risky activities and locations and work sites, and kind of we can work down on that. So those are some ways hazard assessments and identifications can be done. Now that we have that as kind of an introduction, what we're going to look at is recognizing specific fall hazards. And we'll start again by looking at the occupational health and safety regulations. And this is covered in Part 9 of the regulations. So it says that an employer must ensure you, as the worker, are protected from falling if any of these conditions may happen. You may fall in any of these scenarios. So if you were to fall a vertical distance of 3 meters or more, and this doesn't matter what kind of work site it is, what the landing area is, anything like that, if you can fall 3 meters or 10 feet, you need to be protected from that fall. The next category is if you may fall a distance of less than 3 meters or 10 feet, but it's onto any surface other than a flat solid surface. So if it's a flat solid surface and you're falling less than 3 meters, you do not need protection under this point of the legislation. But if it's less than 3 meters and it's an uneven surface, or it's not a solid surface, then you need protection because there's a greater chance of injury falling onto that surface. Also, if you may fall onto any hazardous substance or object. This can be a multiple array of things, which we'll get into a bit later. But common examples are if you're falling onto something that's sharp, that's pointy, into hazardous chemicals, or something that's very hot or very cold. Those are all hazardous substances that will cause greater chance of injury. If that's the case, you need to be protected from falling. Also, if you may fall through an opening, you need to be protected from falling through that opening. And then finally, if you may fall a vertical distance of 1.2 meters or 4 feet, or more at a permanent work area. So the first point, a vertical distance of 3 meters or more, applies anywhere. Doesn't matter where it is. If you can fall more than 3 meters, you need to be protected. This last point is if it's a permanent work area. So if every day you go to work next to this fall hazard, if it is over 1.2 meters or 4 feet, you need to be protected. So now we'll look at a number of different ways to kind of recognize and rank these fall hazards based on the information we talked about before with risk and severity. Here are some things to consider when you're going out, if you're the employer doing the site assessment, or if you're an employee who's helping with that assessment because you do the work at the application. The first one is the proximity to the hazard, or how close will you be to that fall hazard. A great example of this is there's fall hazards everywhere, and a certain extent is how close are we? So let's say, for example, there's an empty pool. That's a fall hazard. You could fall into that pool. But then it comes into consideration, where are you working? Are you working right at the pool edge, cleaning the pool drain right at the edge? Or are you pressure washing a storage shed that's on the other edge of the parking lot? You could be 50 or 100 meters away from the pool. Is that still a fall hazard that you need to worry about? It's something to consider. But then you also need to consider, are you going to maybe walk near it? Are you pressure washing the shed, but then on your lunch break, you need to walk past the pool to get to the lunchroom? In that case, your proximity to the hazard is changing, and it's definitely something you need to be aware of. And then you get into things, well, how close is too close? Like, what if you're not right at the edge, but you're 10 feet away, or you're 15 feet away? Is that far enough? What is safe? And that's the way you can kind of start to rank your hazards. If you're pressure washing the shed, it's a lot less risk than if you're working at the edge of the pool. And then you can kind of rank them based on how close or how far away you are from the hazard. The next item we need to talk about is slopes. The greater the slope, the greater your chance of falling. This could be, in this case, a slope on a roof. It slopes towards the edge of the roof that you could fall off. But a slope also just represents a slip hazard. If it gets steep enough, it's very difficult to maintain your balance and stay upright, and you could slip down. And that on its own is a hazard. You can slide into something, just lose your balance and slip onto the surface. And in aquatic environments, the other thing we always have to be concerned about is it wet? There's water in aquatic environments, and that greatly reduces the traction you have on the surface. So even if it's not a really steep slope, a little bit of water on a shallow slope can make it very slippery and very hard to stay upright. So all things we need to consider. Generally, what is said is anything greater than a 4 to 12 slope, which means it rises 4 units of height to every 12 units in length. This is also equivalent to 18 degrees. Anything greater than that is too steep. So that means you need, handrails, a rope, you need something to help you position yourself. But like I said, there could be water. In that case, it might be a much lower slope to make sure you can stay upright. So at pools, this could be something like the sloped entryway into a pool, or if there's a ramp, to be aware of those situations. Next, we need to look at edges. So is there a sharp edge? Primary concern here is, will your rope or lanyard contact the edge? This can lead to cutting of the rope or severing of the rope or degradation of the rope. The worst case, of course, is cutting the rope. If you were to fall, the rope contacts this edge and cuts. It's not going to actually catch you in the fall and not be very useful. One thing to note is that edges don't actually have to be very sharp to cut a rope. Often we talk about sharp, we think of like a knife or a razor edge, something that is very sharp. But even just a plain concrete edge or plain steel edge, in the picture here, we've got some roof sheeting. Even that in a fall, because of the forces involved and the sliding and the movement of the rope, that can be sharp enough to cut a rope. So we want to make sure these edges are always padded with some kind of cloth or padding protector on the rope. The other thing to consider is, even if the rope isn't going to fall over it, are you going to contact that edge when you fall? Even if it's not a very high fall, if you're only falling to ground level, or let's say the edge of a pool, you can get a very nasty bruise or injury or even broken bones just due to contacting that edge, because it's not, again, that flat surface we talked about earlier. So we always have to be aware of edges, kind of take note of where they are, and if it is a concern, we need to rank it accordingly. Next, height. This is kind of the classic, most common thing everyone thinks about height. So we look at how tall is the fall hazard. And we kind of naturally look at something and say, it's a greater risk to fall off the very top of this skyscraper versus, falling off the one step to ground level, or, falling to ground level. Just due to that height, there's a greater chance of injury. And this goes back to that energy calculator we looked at earlier. Greater height means there's greater fall energy, and that fall energy is going to be absorbed and impacted into our body. So we definitely have to be aware of it, because more height, more energy, more chance of injury to us. But we often, in looking at height, we ignore low heights. So for example, here we've got a crane maintenance area. And one thing we worry about is the high heights. So, falling from the second story mezzanine or balcony level all the way to the ground. That's a fairly significant height to fall. But we have to be careful in looking at that. We don't ignore lower heights. Like on the left here, we've got this low maintenance area that's, maybe a 4 or 5 foot high level. That still could be a fairly significant fall. And it's important to note that in 2022, 13% of the injury claims in all of Alberta were for falls to the same level. So that's falling to the level you're standing on. We don't often worry about that because it's, it's where we're standing. It's, whatever our center of gravity is to the ground. So maybe 3-4 feet. It's not a great distance, But again, that's 13% of all the injury claims in Alberta. So that's a fairly significant number and something we need to be aware of as well. And that's why we talk about slips and trips. You know, we can slip and just fall to the same level, or we can trip. Box, an edge, a step, whatever it is, we can slip and trip. And that's something we need to be aware of and protect against as much as we can. And this is also why in the regulations, we talked about it, those permanent work areas, if it's anything over 1.2 meters or 4 feet, we need to be protected from those falls. So again, height is very important. The greater height, greater energy, but even those short, low heights are a risk. And then related to height is the available clearance. So the question to ask here is how much clearance is available to safely stop the fall before you hit the lower level. So in this example here, we've got an empty pool. And if you're working on one end, the far end away in the picture, the available clearance is pretty minimal. Whereas if you're working at the close end on the left, you've got a lot more distance to stop your fall. You know, on one end, it looks like it's probably 4 or 5 feet. And on the close end here, it's probably about 10 feet. So it's kind of the inverse of our height requirement. Greater height means we've got greater input energy, greater chance of injury to us. But it also means we've got greater distance to stop the fall in if we're connected to some kind of fall arrest system. And we need to make sure whatever system we're using will actually stop the fall. A common error and misuse of systems is people will connect to a system, and because they're connected, they think they're safe, but they don't realize the system is configured incorrectly, or they're using the wrong piece of equipment, and they're actually, it's not going to stop them before they hit the ground. And in that case, it's not an effective system. So with lanyard systems, you know, your typical 6-foot lanyard that's connected to an anchor, they can require up to 18 feet to stop your fall. So in this case, in our pool, where we're even at the deep end, only 10 feet, that's probably not an effective system, because if it requires 18 feet and we only have 10, we're going to hit the bottom of the pool long before that system actually stops and falls. So whenever you're using a system, you need to look at not only what the hazard is, but is your system suitably prepared and designed for the usage you're using. And that'll be included in the documentation of the system. That'll also be something you cover if you take a more in-depth fall protection course. They'll talk about how to calculate how much clearance do you need. Another thing when looking at clearance is, are there any obstructions in the way? Here's an example of some guys working on scaffolding. They're probably 10 to 12 feet above the ground. So they've got, let's say 12 feet of clearance. But then as we can see, there's a chain link fence, there's this wooden barricade. There are a lot of obstructions in the way that if they were to fall, even if they could get stopped, let's say it would stop them falling 8 feet, they'll stop them before they hit the ground. It's not going to stop them before they hit this fence. That is a significant chance of injury. They've got tops of the chain link, they've got the bar. All of those will cause an impact injury, possible cuts from the chain link. So we need to make sure, even if we've got lots of distance to the ground, are there other objects in the way? So are there any other obstructions you could get in a fall? And this is related to landing area. So what is the actual landing area? As we talked about in looking at the OHS, or the Occupational Health and Safety Regulations, they talk about anything that is worse than a solid flat surface, or anything that has an unusual possibility of injury. So we talked about fences in the last one. A lot of fences have, little decorative heads that can be pointy and sharp. That's definitely something we have to look out for. Also water, as you can see in this picture. And again, we're in aquatic environments, so there's likely going to be water at some locations at some points in time. So if we're falling into water, we need to make sure we're protected from that. And the Occupational Health and Safety Regulations even have a clause specific to this. They say that employers must ensure that any workers must use a fall protection system in combination with a life jacket or other flotation device if the worker may fall into water that exposes them to a hazard of drowning. And we know basically any amount of water provides a drowning hazard. So we need to protect against that. Whether that's, stopping the fall before you can impact the water, or like the regulation says, providing some kind of flotation device. So that's definitely something we need to look at. We need to consider when we're ranking hazards. Not only are we falling, but what are we falling onto or into? Another thing we need to look at is what is the activity that's going to be performed, or what task will you be completing? And there's a few different aspects to this. One is, are you doing heavy work where you need to focus on using both hands, your legs, being fully involved in this task? As you can see in the picture here, this worker is tightening bolts on this anchor base. So they're using both hands on the torque wrench. They're using their legs to brace themselves. They're fully concentrating on this task. They're not really concentrated on the fall hazard because they're doing their job. Contrast that with something where if you were just walking along the edge or doing like a visual inspection, something simple like that, you can focus more of your energy on paying attention to the hazard, where if it's a more involved work task, you're likely to be more focused on the task and less mindful of the actual hazard. So that's something very important to consider. The other thing is the nature of the work going to increase your risk of falling? In this case, with this worker torquing up these bolts, if the wrench were to slip or their hands were to slip, because of the direction they're pulling on that wrench, they could potentially kind of catapult themselves or launch themselves over the edge just due to slipping in their work task. So what are you doing, and is it going to increase or decrease your risk of falling over that fall hazard? Along with the task you're completing, we also have to worry about things of, how long is the task going to take? Is it a simple, visual check where you can walk by, do the check, and you're done in a minute or two? Or is it something where you're going to be, working there? Are you doing repairs? Are you doing painting? Are you doing cleaning? That's going to take a couple hours of it. The longer you're there, the greater your chance of falling, that probability we talked about, it increases. Also, how many people are there? The more people there are, the greater chance one of them will fall. Again, increasing that probability and the risk of a fall happening. And then how often and how many occurrences are there of this task? Is it, there's one location, there's maybe one diving board you need to work on, or are there, 10 different locations? There's probably not 10 diving boards at your pool, but are there 3 guard chairs, for example, that you need to go up to? And how often do you need to do the work? Is it an annual thing when you do your annual maintenance, or is it something that needs to be done every shift? If it's something that's done every shift, you probably need different protection than something that's done on an annual basis where you can bring in a specialized system just for that one case. So all these are important factors to consider, all related to the activity and the task you're actually going to be doing that you need to protect from. Another thing is the existing control measures. So an important question to ask is, what control measures are in place? Is there nothing in place? Is it just there's a hazard and you just have to deal with it and kind of hope for the best? That's not a very good or effective control measure. Is there a full fall protection system where there's procedure for putting on a harness and what lanyard to select and what anchors? That's a much better control measure. So hopefully and ideally, you should have a proper control measure with a plan and a list of equipment that you can use to be safe. But related to that is the protection actually adequate? As you can see in the picture here, there's a couple 2x4s stretched across this large elevator shaft opening. And these probably aren't an effective means of protection. If someone were to fall against them, we can all picture there's a very good chance those 2x4s are just going to bend, probably pry out, and not actually stop someone from falling into this elevator shaft. So in that case, they might actually be worse than having nothing, because on quick look, maybe you're not thinking because you're carrying something, you see, okay, there's guards in place, I don't need to worry about falling in there, when in the fact they're not effective guards. So when you're doing your hazard assessment and walking around the site, it's not enough to say, well, there's something there, so it's protected and move on. You need to look at it and ask, is it effective? Is it actually going to accomplish the job and provide the protection we require? And then the environment. What are the environmental conditions that we're going to be exposed to? So in this example, in the photo, we see it's a snowy day up on a roof. Snow on a roof can be quite slippery. That's something we need to be aware of. As I mentioned already, it's an aquatic environment. So there's very likely going to be water that's going to be slippery no matter what surface it's on, unless it's a very special high tracking surface. So when you look at, is it water? What's the water on? Is it on tile and going to be very slippery? Is it something on like the diving board of a slide where, slides are specifically intended to slide? That's a slip. So that's something we need to look out for and be conscious of. Also, is it winter? Aquatic environments, if it's an outdoor pool in the winter, there's likely going to be ice, which is even more slippery, especially if there's a layer of water on top. So we need to look at things like that. But then there's also other environmental factors as well. Like, what if it's a very sunny day and there's glare and reflection off the water in the pool? That can be a hazard as well. Not that it, makes this more slippery or more likely to trip, but it can obscure our vision, and that can make us more likely to trip. So all things we need to consider, and you need to do that consideration for all the tests. If an outdoor pool and it's the lifeguards doing their rounds on the pool or climbing into the lifeguard chair, you need to consider all possible environments. Is it, in the summer, we need to worry about sun. In the winter, we might need to worry about snow and ice. So taking into account all the possible conditions and how they could change over time that task is going to be done. We also need to think about the safety culture. So what is the attitude towards safety? In this picture, and we've all seen on social media the pictures of people doing outrageous things like this person where, we've got a ladder on top of some masonry stones, on top of a table, on top of tables. Definitely not a safe situation. But is that the attitude of safety at your facility? Hopefully not. Hopefully it's very much the opposite, where management is promoting, we need to work safe, look out for hazards. And if you're in management, hopefully that's what you are doing, being aware of safety. And then is there openness to bring up new concerns? Hey, I'm a junior lifeguard at the pool. I have a question about this. I'm concerned. That should be responded to appropriately. Is that something that is done and you are doing? That all adds to the safety culture and makes it less likely for something to happen. And then also associated with the safety culture is, have you received the proper training? As I mentioned at the beginning of the course, to effectively use a fall protection system, you need in-depth training to use it properly and safely. So there's nothing wrong with not being trained, but you need to know that that is required. And that's one of the purposes of this webinar, is what are the requirements? So if you haven't been trained, then a great question to ask is, can I get the training? And there's nothing wrong with asking those questions. So it's very encouraged to make sure you have the knowledge to know what to ask, and then have the openness to actually ask those questions. To consider is the emergency response. So what kind of emergency response is available? A big part of this will be where your facility is located. Is it located in a major urban center where it takes 5 minutes for the fire department and the ambulance to get to site to provide emergency response? Or are you in a small rural municipality where maybe there isn't even an emergency department? So there's no ambulance to call. That's a big factor on what kind of emergency response you have, and will likely influence how much training you need. If there's no outside, emergency department to call, you likely need to have extra training for you and your coworkers and the staff at the facility to provide some sort of emergency response until outside help can get there. And that's all something that needs to be assessed before you start work as part of this hazard assessment, because that'll influence what kind of tasks you might even be willing to undertake. If something has a high likelihood of falling and you need some emergency help that's not going to be available, maybe you just don't even do that task. But it's important to identify that beforehand so you can address it and not realize it after the fact when you need an ambulance or when you need a fire truck with a ladder, that it's not going to get there. That's too late. So make sure you think about that beforehand as well. And then finally, there's a couple other considerations that are somewhat generic to any kind of hazard, but we'll discuss them here as well. The first one is distractions. Is the work happening while there are patrons in the pool? If there's public around, there's maybe some people playing, there's lots of people, that can cause a distraction just from the task you're doing, and then remove your attention from the hazard. Also, what kind of chemicals are? Again, in an aquatic environment, we need some kind of chemicals to treat the water, whether that's chlorine or salts or other chemicals. Those are something to be aware of. Those might pose other hazards, not necessarily fall hazards, but chlorine exposure can be dangerous. So we need to be aware of that. And then also thinking about how those chemicals will impact our equipment. Certain harnesses and lanyards are rated for harsh chemicals, but a lot are not. So when purchasing equipment, that's something we need to look at. Is this equipment rated for the chemical environment it's going to be used in? If not, we need to make sure we ask for the right equipment or find a different procedure. Maybe we can't use equipment and we need to use some kind of barrier or other protections. What kind of tools and equipment are going to be used for the work task? Are we using heavy equipment, tools, saws, jackhammers, like heavy equipment? That might pose another hazard to our fall protection equipment because it could be cut or abraded, or there's extra heat, if we're welding. Those are all hazards. Versus if we're just, walking to do an inspection, there's not really any tools that could damage our fall protection equipment. But also related to tools and equipment is just, do those tools pose a hazard to us? Are they going to generate excessive noise we need to be worried about? Do they pose, cut hazards to us or our fingers? So we need to make sure we're not just looking at fall hazards, but we look at the full range of every hazard that could possibly be there. Another hazard associated with this is confined spaces. Depending on the geometry and the depth of, let's say we're going into a pool, that could technically count as a confined space. According to the regulations, they define a confined space as a restricted space which may become hazardous to a worker entering it because of either the atmosphere that may become injurious or toxic, or due to conditions or changing circumstances within the space that provide potential for injury, or the potential or inherent characteristics of an activity that can produce adverse or harmful consequences in that space. So, let's say it's a dive tank and you have to do work partway up the ladder. Are there conditions that could cause harmful situations due to the nature, the geometry, and the depth of that space that could potentially be defined as a confined space? So that's something you need to think about. Or, is it in the boiler room? Is there some kind of tight, restricted space? You might have some fumes from the chemicals or the boilers. Those are all things we need to worry about and look out for, whether or not it's a fall hazard. And then the last thing is combined hazards. Is it a confined space plus a fall hazard? Then we need to worry about both of those conditions and make sure all our equipment is compatible. Or, like we talked about earlier, if there's a chance of falling into water and drowning, you may need a life jacket or some other flotation device. Well, then we need to think about, how do we wear a life jacket while also wearing a harness? So those are all things we need to think about. Now that we've looked at all of these different categories and different ways to think about fall hazards, we're going to look at some common hazards specific to aquatic centers. So as part of this working group putting together webinars, we came up with a list 5 common ones that we think are, almost universal at any aquatic system. And this can be the empty pool basin, surface to surface. So this could just be, slipping on the tile pool deck and then landing on that deck. Elevated surfaces. So this is, maybe a guard chair, something like that that's elevated above the surface you're falling to. And then there's diving boards, which would be a specific type of elevated surface. So falling off the diving board. And then the last one is pool slides. So again, we talked about it's a slide, it's slippery, it's a slip hazard, but also it starts at some height. So there's a fall hazard down the slide, but also off the slide due to the height. So now we'll look specifically at an empty pool basin and just run through all those categories we looked at. So in this example, an empty pool basin. If we were to say this is a small rural municipality, just running through our list, what do we have to think about? First thing, example, if we were to say you're preparing materials to clean and repaint the pool. So at that edge, we can see there's some drums, there's a pallet. We need to get those materials prepared and then into the pool so that they can actually, clean the pool and then repaint it. In this case, is there a fall hazard and why? Looking at all those characteristics. So the first thing we had on our list is proximity. How close are we to this fall hazard? In this case, we're working right at the edge of the pool. So there's a fairly significant fall hazard because we're close to it. Next, we talked about the slope. What is the slope? At this case, it's on the pool deck. So it's basically flat. We don't really have much of a slope to worry. Is there any water on there? We talked about, water or other conditions can make even low slopes slippery. In this case, the pool is empty, so there's not a lot of water from the pool itself. And it looks like, and we'll get into this environment, but it's, a sunny day. It doesn't look like there's much water or anything to kind of contaminate that slope. So in that case, the slope itself is a fairly low risk. Next, we talked about edges. Do we have a concern with edges? We've got, this concrete looking, could be concrete, could be tile, could be some kind of clay edge at the edge of the pool. As we talked about, even just concrete can be a hazard for pool or for lanyards and ropes. So that's something, if we're using a fall arrest system with a lanyard, we might want to put some padding down along that edge. It's also just something to worry about for ourselves. If we're to fall, concrete is hard. There's a very good chance we could injure ourselves. If your head hits concrete, there's a great chance of concussion or other injuries. So we might want to protect against that in some way. Next is the height. So what is the height? In this case, it's the depth of the pool. So at that edge, we said, it's maybe a meter, maybe 1.5 meters, so maybe 3 to 5 feet. Technically, because this is not a permanent work area, it only needs, and it's falling onto that flat pool surface, we only would need a fall protection system if it's over 3 meters. Does that mean we just don't do anything? We still need to assess the hazard and determine what is a safe procedure and what's a safe precaution for it. But the other thing to consider about that is what happens is if, we're starting in the morning at this edge of the pool, but maybe in the afternoon or the next day, we need to work at the other edge, at the close side of the picture, where we're falling into the dive side of the pool, where it's 3 meters or 10 feet. In that case, we do need fall protection, and we've got a greater height hazard. Like we talked about earlier, related to height is the clearance. So how much clearance do we have? In this case, it's the exact same as the height. It's roughly 1 meter at the side we've shown with the X, and roughly 3 meters at the close side of the diagram. So we need to make sure whatever fall protection we use will stop the fall within that distance. Our landing area, as I mentioned already, is just this flat surface that's fairly safe. We don't have a lot of hazards associated with that. We're not going to fall onto a fence or anything sharp or uneven. So that's fairly safe. What kind of activity are we doing? It's, manual handling of, these barrels, maybe there's some boxes, some painting supplies, some cleaning supplies. So it's not super heavy work, but we need to make sure, when we're carrying material, it doesn't obstruct our view and cause us just to walk right into the pool. It could be a very significant hazard. So we need to be aware of that in our activity. Maybe there's some kind of barrier we can do to make sure we don't do that unintentionally. And associated with activity, how often is this done? This is not a daily thing. This is, maybe once a year we drain the pool and repaint it. Maybe we only repaint it every 5 years. So it's fairly infrequent and we can come up with a very custom solution. What is the environment? In this case, in the picture, it's a bright, sunny day. It's dry, like we talked about. It's not raining. There doesn't seem to be any water. So it looks like fairly favorable conditions. But we also need to consider, we live in Alberta. What if a thunderstorm comes? That can happen very quickly in the summer. So let's check the forecast. Let's maybe be aware and just be constantly paying attention to some of those conditions that could change and cause greater hazards. What is the safety culture? We don't know, but let's say it's at your pool. We'll assume your pool has a great safety culture. There's a safety talk every morning. The managers are very helpful. Everyone's encouraging. That's great. And that's going to make it safer for us. And especially if there's other people looking out for us, protecting us from the work, maybe catching us. Oh, that's maybe too high. You can't see. Just those little reminders can have a huge impact on safety. And what is the emergency response? As I mentioned, if it's a small rural municipality, maybe there's no hospital in the town. Maybe there's an ambulance, but maybe you have to drive 45 minutes to the nearest hospital. That might influence what kind of safety precautions we put in place to add extra safety to it. And then finally, our other conditions. A couple other things is that, it's closed to the public, so we don't have to worry about those distractions. But what about distractions from coworkers? Hopefully that's not the case. And as I mentioned, they're actually encouraging and helpful. But, even just other people being around can be a distraction. And then we talked about, cleaning and painting. There could be some chemicals involved. We need to make sure whatever equipment we're using is compatible with those chemicals. So that's one example, and that's kind of how you would go through the process. So you look at your situation, what are we doing? And then you can kind of run through the list of what are different activities we need to do. What's the height, what's the proximity, what's the slope, run through the list, and then we can evaluate and rank every hazard. So in conclusion, we talked about hazard identification, we talked about the different occupational health and safety requirements. We talked about different ways of assessing that risk with the energy wheel, the energy calculator, the risk, which is the probability and severity. So all different methods to identify the hazard. We talked about recognizing fall hazards and the different aspects to consider, like the proximity, the height, the landing area, the clearance, the environment. And then we talked about common hazards at aquatic centers, surface to surface, the empty pools, elevated surface, diving boards, and pool slides. And then we looked at one example. So as a conclusion of this webinar, I want to remind you that there are other resources available. You can look online at the AMHSA website. You can see here, as Rob mentioned, this will be made available. There's a whole list of downloadable information you can get there. There's links, there's other aspects and other information you can get to help you. And then there's other webinars as well. As I mentioned at the start, the second webinar, or this one, will be on types of fall protection, including guardrails, and that'll be on April 30th. And then the last webinar will be on May 30th, and that'll be on fall protection plan and system implementation. So those will help give you more detail on how to actually protect from these hazards that we've now identified. There's some other training that's available as well. So AARFP and AMHSA have partnered together to provide some program certificates. So one is the Aquatic Safety Operator Certificate, but they also have the Arena Safety Operator, building maintenance safety operator, and parks and sports field safety operator. So those provide some more in-depth courses and some certification that you can use to increase your safety awareness and then help you implement that at your facility. And then there's also other in-depth fall protection training. So you can get fall protection user training, you can get inspector training, you can get competent person training, which is more aimed at how do you develop these fall protection plans and do some of these hazard assessments. So there's multiple levels you can look into and do some research. So with that, I'd like to say thank you for attending the webinar. Thank you for listening. Here is the contact information for High Engineering. Again, I'm from High Engineering. If you have any questions, we're happy to help. And then also AMHSA, who has facilitated and run this awareness campaign. Here's all of their information. So at this point, I would like to open the floor. If anyone has any questions, I'm happy to answer those as best I can.